Hey there, everybody. My name is Jeremy Siskind. I'm the author of this book. Oh, look, here's a copy that you could have at jeremysiskind.com. And today's subject is how to practice jazz. I so often get asked, what you actually do in the practice room. That I'm going to give you my best advice as to a good jazz practice session. But first, let's have like a little bit of music. So I'm just going to play one chorus of blues. Here goes. So here's my 4-part jazz practice plan. And the 4 parts are as follows. First, technique. I don't care how brilliant of a musician you are, if you can't play an instrument or sing, and really express yourself adequately, then it doesn't really matter. So you've got to get your technique down. Second is transposition and repetition. Going over the basics, getting new vocabulary, getting new patterns into your fingers. Number 3 is actually working on tunes. You can have the greatest technique in the world. If you don't know any tunes and you can't apply it to any tunes, it's not going to matter. And then number 4 is engaging with the recorded history of the music. And I'm going to show you how these 4 elements actually all interrelate and they all intertwine and feed one another. And that's actually hopefully the greatest takeaway, is that you can kind of create your own, you can generate your own material in a good jazz practice session. So let's dive in, starting with technique. I've listed 7 things under technique. I'm sure you can probably think of more. Scales, arpeggios, scale patterns, etudes. Could be classical etudes, could be a jazz etude from a book you've bought. Finger exercises, tricky melodies that you want to use as a warm-up. Or you could practice transcriptions as a way to train your technique. Let's go over each of these just a little bit. So scales. The older I get, the more I am a believer that you just cannot master your scales enough. And you always want to think of new, exciting ways to practice scales, or even maybe new and exciting scales to practice. My latest scale practice, I've been taking my harmonic minor scales, starting them a tenth apart, them in contrary motion. So I just really want to know those scales well. The other thing that I do with scales frequently is I push the metronome, by which I mean that I might start at, let's say, 120 beats per minute for 16th notes, and then I'll just keep going 5 beats per minute faster, 5 beats per minute faster. Just work those fingers out. Try to gain some speed. Arpeggios. Arpeggios are an important part of technique on any instrument. Again, practice triad arpeggios, absolutely, and then you're a jazz musician, so practice 7th arpeggios, That's a major 7th arpeggio. I'm starting at 2 different places, right? I'm starting at the root in the left hand, the 3rd in the right hand. And again, once you've got it, push that tempo. Make sure that you're getting your fingers a really good workout. Scale patterns. This is huge, right? In jazz, we don't think of scales as something that go up and down. We think of them as a set of notes that we want to be able to improvise from. So when you're practicing a scale, you don't want to just practice that, but you want to also practice skips. Or 7th chords. The more scale patterns that you know, the greater your mastery of a scale will be. Etudes. The Chopin etudes, if you're a pianist, they're just going to build your technique so much. I know lots of musicians have published their own etudes. People like Oscar Peterson have etudes on the piano. I have a few go-to Chopin etudes that people who know me are probably tired of hearing. I love the etudes on 6. finger exercises. Maybe you have a teacher or you saw an important finger exercise that you love. Tricky melodies. I love practicing as a warm-up bebop melodies like Donna Lee in Contrary Motion. Ooh, I'm not warmed up. Or transcriptions. That can also get you warmed up, or classical pieces of any kind. And by the way, I'm not saying that you need to do all of these things every day. Of course not. You'll probably go on, you'll have moments where you're obsessed with scales. You'll have moments you're obsessed with a certain etude. I don't think you can possibly do all these things every day. But I'd rotate through, 3 or 4 items that you're doing in that first section of practice. Okay, so that's your technique. The second thing is transposition or repetition. And so this is, I consider it kind of quote unquote dry practice in that there's a right and a wrong answer. Whereas our third and fourth types of practice are going to be not so much dry practice. They're going to have some room for interpretation and creativity. But in this transposition and repetition, you're going to work on licks, voicings, maybe specific chord progressions like the blues or rhythm changes, or concepts. And I want to talk more about concepts. But let's address these one at a time. So, licks, I think most people who study jazz are familiar with the concept of a lick. It's most common to practice 2-5-1 licks. But, you could practice a lick that just works over a minor chord. You could practice a blues lick. You could practice a 1-6-2-5 lick. There's all kinds of licks to practice. I recommend practicing, I believe there's 5 stages when you practice a lick. So let's take this lick. I sometimes get to my students. Okay. The first thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that you're playing it with really good swing feel and articulation. For more advanced players, this shouldn't be an issue. For less advanced players, I want you to really think about where you're putting the accents and what your fingering should be. Okay. Second thing would be to coordinate the left hand with it. For my less advanced players, I would do that with patterns like the Charleston and the reverse Charleston. Reverse Charleston. Okay? Or if you're working on something else like a bass line, coordinate the bass line with it. Right? Or maybe you're somebody who's working on double octave playing. Or you're working on playing in thirds. Right? Or you're working on playing in contrary motion. That was lame, but you get what I'm saying. Coordinate something with it in the left hand that's going to be a challenge for you. Or maybe you're working on stride piano. And you want to work on that. So that's the second step. Coordinate something with it in the left hand. The third step is probably the most time-consuming and intimidating, which is to transpose it, ideally to all keys. Sometimes I get the question, should I transpose something to all keys or just a few keys if it's going to take me a long time? And I think that you should be done with a lick in a week, okay? And if that means that you're only going to be able to really master it in 3 or 4 keys, then I would limit it to that. I think if you're working with a lick for much longer than that, it's going to just take over your life. It's not going to be very efficient. Transposition is like a muscle that gets better and better, gets stronger and stronger as you practice it. So, if you're at the stage where you can only get it into 3 different keys in a week, fine, do that. Next week, aim for 4. The week after that, aim for 5. It'll get better and better. So now practice this. Right? Some people ask me, should I go up by half steps, down by half steps, around the circle of fifths? I don't think it really matters. I would do all of the above, any of the above, whatever it takes to get to all keys. So that's the third step, transpose. The fourth step, working with the lick, is to apply it to tunes. Okay? I know so many students who learn licks and then never use them. And it just drives me crazy because you're wasting so much time. So if you're working on Autumn Leaves, start putting it in everywhere possible. Overdo it. Put it in everywhere that you possibly can to Autumn Leaves. 2-5-1 you see, put that lick in. The next thing is voicings, right? Especially if you're a pianist or guitarist, this is probably going to be part of your practice session. If you're in your first 2 years of study, probably you're going to mainly be working on 2-5-1 voicings. And we could talk about various exercises for that, but you want to always practice with a metronome. See how fast you can get with those 2-5-1 voicings. But you might be working on some other kind of voicing. Maybe you're working on shearing voicing. Maybe you're working on modal voicings. And you just want to get those basics down, right? This section number 2, this is the time to just get those essential kind of fundamental building blocks down. Chord progressions, just do you know the blues progression? Do you know a 1-6-2-5 progression? Or you might need to kind of pause and, maybe you're working on the backdoor 2-5 progression. If you don't know, the backdoor 2-5 is kind of like an F minor to B flat 7 to C major. I have a student who's tried that in every key, right? Finding that progression. So it's kind of working on voicings, but with specific progressions. And the last thing here is concepts, and that's maybe the trickiest thing, but it's one of my favorite things. And so a concept doesn't have specific notes, but it's something that you notice a musician doing. I'll give you a bunch of examples for a concept. I teach my students what I call the Wynton Kelly concept. Right, the Wynton Kelly concept is playing something pretty similar that first goes up to a note and then goes down to the same note. So if I were going to practice that, I might start out with just a drone. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to play in C major. And I'm going to only play licks that honor that Wynton Kelly concept. Up to the same note and down to the same note. So I can do it just like that over a drone. And then we'll talk about applying concepts to a tune momentarily. Okay, so that's what you're doing in number 2. Is you're taking licks, voicings, progressions, and then maybe concepts. And you're going over them and over them and over them until they start to kind of seep into your skin. I'm realizing that I forgot my 5th thing that you do with a lick. Good thing I remembered. And that is to extract a concept. Okay, so this lick, there's not a single correct concept for this lick. I'll give you a few examples. I like how it kind of uses the ninths as the edges of this phrase. So I could come up, when I'm doing a concept, I could think about highlighting the ninth as the beginning and end of a phrase. So I could play, or, right, I'm playing ninth as the top and bottom note. Or maybe I like that first rhythm, ga-da-ga-da-da. And so I'm going to practice improvising with that rhythm. Right, I'm starting every one with the same rhythm. Or I could take this lick, and I could say that I like that it ends with that leap. Right, it's the leap of a sixth. How cool is that? So I'm going to do now all phrases with a leap for an ending. And I could try making it go up, I could try making it go down. Right. And as I'm practicing these concepts, I can do it over a drone, or I can start doing it over a 2-5-1. right? So a concept is kind of like a lick, but it's not specific notes. It's just the general idea, the gist of it. Okay, so then you're practicing tunes, right? If you don't practice tunes, you're kind of like a basketball player who just like practices shooting free throws and never plays a game. You're gonna learn so much by getting in a game. You know, practicing free throws is fun, it's important, but we want to really get into the game. So, you know, the first thing that we have to do with tunes as musicians, we have to start building a repertoire of tunes. So the first thing that we want to do is learn and memorize tunes. And, you know, we could talk for a long time about the best strategies for learning and memorizing tunes, but that might bog down this video, which is already getting kind of long. So, you know, I recommend having 2 tunes every 2 weeks that you're working on, cycle through them, something like that. And tune learning is also a muscle that you're going to continue to work, and it's going to keep getting stronger and stronger. The next thing is you want to apply what you did in number 2 to those tunes. I already kind of showed you how I would apply a lick to Autumn Leaves. But if you're working on a particular voicing, you know, you want to work on that with the tune that you're playing. So if you're working on, so what voicing's on Autumn Leaves? Figure out the voicings for the melody, and then maybe try to improvise using those same licks and voicings that you're working on. You want to, of course, figure out your building blocks of music, scales and arpeggios. And, you know, there's so many exercises that we could do on tunes. I'll give you just a couple of my favorites, but, you know, I also put out a lot of videos that have different improvisation games, so I'm not able to get to all of them. A couple of my just favorite absolute building block exercises is practicing a 3-5-7-9 arpeggio on each chord. So for Autumn Leaves, right? I think that's absolutely essential. And then from there, I would try to find close arpeggios. So half step before each of those. Right, or 2 half steps. And, you know, made some of them go down. I mean, from that exercise, there's so many different exercises that could branch off. Another of my favorite exercises also features the third on the downbeat. And that exercise is to play consistent 8th notes, but land on the 3rd on every single new chord. So. Okay. There's a million exercises like this trying to get changes. Maybe you want to practice phrasing on tune. Maybe you want to practice, I often work with students doing play 2, rest 2, where you play 2 measures with the right hand and then you rest for 2 measures. And then maybe you want to practice play 1, rest 1. So there's a ton of exercises like that, and I would just say, you know, be creative first, and then secondly, you know, if you're bored with what you've already come up with, pay attention to this channel, and I'll keep those exercises coming. And then apply concepts. So if you're working on the Wynton Kelly concept over a drone or over a 2-5-1, then I would start applying it to your tunes. Notice that whenever I'm practicing, I'm overdoing something. Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to form a habit. And then what I would do, is I would step back and I would play the tune mostly freely, but try to get some of that concept in. So just playing. You hear it there? Let's hear that. Down to one, up to the other. So I would overdo it and then scale it back. So that's at least some of what you're doing when you're practicing tunes. I'll give you one more idea for tunes that I didn't originally write down, so I'm adding it now, which is what I call a dream solo. And for a dream solo, you're going to separate out the steps of coming up with the improvisation, inventing it, and then practicing and executing it. So for a dream solo, you're going to write out a solo using licks, concepts, things that you've been practicing. And then you're going to practice that like an etude until you can play it exactly with perfect time, perfect swinging, good fingering, good articulation, all that stuff. All right, which brings us to number 4, which I think is hopefully the most enjoyable, fun, exciting part of your practice session, which is engaging with the recorded history of the music. Jazz is an oral tradition, and as brilliant as you might find what I have to say, it doesn't really matter who your teacher is, how good you are, if you're not listening all the time to jazz. So there's 4 things that I've listed. I'm sure there's many more things that you could think of to do. The first is focused listening. Just closed eyes, listening to the same track over and over again. One particular exercise I've heard was an exercise at Clifford Brown's, where he would listen to an album however many times for the number of players that were on the album. So if it was a quartet, he'd listen 4 times. And for each time, he would focus on just one of the players, so that he would get this really complete view of what was happening in the ensemble. But you could also do your focused listening, tuning into a specific aspect, right? It could be dynamics. Is there a dynamic change? It could be listening and paying attention for the form, right? Do you need a little bit extra practice figuring out the form? It could be listening to phrasing. How are artists phrasing? It could be listening for shapes of lines. When are they hitting their peak? It could be listening for interaction between musicians. It could be just listening to the comping of the pianist. How long? How short? What sorts of voicings are they using? Could be listening for non-chord tones. There's a million different things that you could focus in as you're listening. The second thing you're probably familiar with if you're a student of jazz, which is transcribing. This is writing down a solo from a recording. There's so many reasons to transcribe. At the base, though, it's because you're musically curious, right? You've heard something that you love, and you want to figure out what it is, play it, and then figure out what makes it tick, right? So transcribing, more than a practice habit, it's just a habit of being a curious person, I think. And there's a lot of different methods. A lot of people are very insistent about how you should transcribe. I've met teachers who I really, really respect who, are encouraged singing a solo first. I've met teachers who say you should never write the solo down, and everything in between. But I think the important things about transcribing, one, is it trains your ear. The actual act of doing it trains your ear. And it starts getting the feel of jazz into your body by osmosis. 2 is it trains your muscle memory, right? It trains your technique. And it shows your hands and every part of your body what it feels like to play a Thelonious Monk solo or a Wynton Kelly solo or an Oscar Peterson solo. And then 3rd, you want to do your brain work. You want to analyze the transcription. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. The next thing is playing along or singing along with the recording, right? It could be that you want to kind of get Art Blakey's time feel. So you're going to play along with Art Blakey and really listen to his ride cymbal pattern while he's playing. Or it could be that you just want practice following the form. Or you want practice comping. And so you're going to comp behind the Jazz Messengers, and you're going to notice how Bobby Timmons comps and try to imitate. And then the fourth one, I love this. I call it stopping and starting. And this is, for me, I'm just going to sit down at the piano, listen to a recording, and when I hear something that I love, I'm going to press pause, and I'm going to play around with that idea for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, depending on what the idea is. Doesn't mean that I have to figure out the exact notes, but maybe I figure out the shape of the line, and I'm like, ooh, that was cool. I want to make a line with the same shape or the same rhythm. Or maybe it was something that the pianist did between his right and his left hand, and that gives me an idea. But that can be just as good as transcribing. So that's part 4. Now comes the conclusion where I wrap it up, which is to say that all 4 of these parts should go together, and you've already seen something, right? What you do in your technique and your transposition and repetition, that's what you're going to practice when you practice your tunes, right? If you're working on a lick, you're going to practice it in your tunes. If you're working on a scale pattern, see if you can incorporate that into your tune, right? If you're working on a particular finger exercise for a particular technique, work that in as you play your tunes. And then where do you get those ideas for licks, for voicings, for chord progressions, and for concepts in particular that you want to pursue? Of course you get those from recordings, right? You hear something that another musician does, and you want to imitate that, right? You want to figure it out. And so if you're doing this right, number 4 should kind of generate material for 1 and 2, and your practice for 1 and 2 should kind of create the backbone for what you're going to be applying to number 3, right? Which is what we ultimately want to do. Number 3, we just want to play tunes well. That's kind of the end goal. So number 4 feeds 1 and 2, 1 and 2 feeds 3, and hopefully there's this just kind of blossoming that comes from the recorded history and then is practiced and worked on by you. I think that's all I have for you guys. I'm going to switch camera view so you can see me. Oh, that's a terrible camera view. That one's better. I would love to hear your comments about what you think of this practice technique, whether it's helpful, whether you have other ideas. You can get my book, which has so many practice ideas, playing solo jazz piano. You can get this on my website, jeremysiskind.com. Like, subscribe, comment. I'll see y'all soon.